In 1953, I watched the coronation of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as an 8-year-old boy on our neighbour's newly bought TV. Now, 70 years on, and having spent much of my life researching and writing about the British monarchy, I'm about to witness our new king inaugurated in a slimmed-down version of that same ceremony. It's more than pageantry, more even than the king's self-dedication before God. It's a profoundly political act, because compressed into 2 hours of pomp and circumstance are 1,200 years of history. They explain how we came to be governed with moderation and stability, not just as subjects, but as citizens, not beneath the king, but in cooperation with him. That's the story I want to share with you now. This is Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens of England have been crowned for almost 1,000 years. On May 6th, Charles III will join their number. He'll be consecrated and crowned by the grace of God to the sound of organs and trumpets. But he'll also swear oaths. These oaths amount to a contract between the king and his people, and the penalties for breaking those oaths have been terrible. Because England is a royal republic, and any king who refuses to recognize that fact has paid the price of execution and the toppling of his crown. The last king to suffer that fate was also called King Charles. The history of the English monarchy stretches back over 1,500 years into the mists of the Dark Ages. But the story of the coronation begins here, in Bath. England's founding father, King Alfred the Great, had united the English to defeat the Vikings, and his descendants extended those conquests into an overlordship of the whole of Britain, including Wales, Scotland, and the Western Isles. Now, Alfred's great-grandson, Edgar, wanted to cement his rule with a display of unprecedented grandeur. It's Whitsunday 973. Whitsunday is the feast which celebrates the moment at which the Holy Spirit descended on Christ's disciples. And the day's been chosen by St. Dunstan, the great Bishop of England, to crown in Christian terms the King of all the English, Edgar. It's going to be his second coronation, maybe even more, because now it's a quasi-imperial. He's going to be crowned not simply King of the English, but overlord of all Britain. St. Dunstan has given very careful thought to the ceremony, and he produces what's called an ordo. That's a ceremonial which becomes a model, not simply for England, but for Hungary, for Poland, for Milan, and above all, for now. On May 6th, you're going to hear roughly what they heard on Whitsunday 973. Why Bath for an imperial coronation? Because Bath is both a great Christian centre, we're here in the Abbey, but right next door there is the grandest remains of Roman Britain, the Baths, possibly still with their great curved roof, though it may have been half in ruin. So it's a symbol of a world of Christianity and Rome and England. The service goes like this. It's so familiar. Edgar begins, because he's a pious king, by taking an oath administered by St. Dunstan. It's a threefold oath. The first thing that he does is to swear to keep true peace to the church and people. Then, because these are pretty rough times, to repress rapine and iniquity. And then finally, literally the words which King Charles will swear, to do justice in mercy and in truth. So he's sworn an oath. He's made a contract with God to be a good king. At that moment, you go back beyond Rome even. You go back to the Old Testament. And at that point, you hear what we will hear. Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king, and Edgar is anointed, consecrated, devoted to God. And then the ceremony unfolds with all the apparatus, the regalia of monarchy. First a ring is put upon a finger, then he's girded with a sword, and then at the climax, the crown is put upon his head, and he is offered the two scepters, the actual scepter and the rod. He's acclaimed. He's king, a Christian king. And it all relaxes a bit, and they have the coronation feast, at which is reported, because he's a very virtuous king, that nobody gets too drunk. And nobody was more aware of this legacy of Christian monarchy than Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, that moment of her coronation that was private, that we didn't see, her anointing. So, on the 1000th anniversary of Edgar's coronation, she came here and she knelt to commemorate that first anointing. That anointing is the central ritual of the elaborate ceremony we'll see on Saturday. We talk of the event as the coronation. That's to say, the putting of the corona, the crown, on the monarch's head. But actually, the most important, the most ancient bit, going right back to the Old Testament, is the idea of consecration, the anointing with holy oils. It was, of course, the bit of the service that the Queen, for her coronation back in 1953, insisted you didn't see. Similarly, King Charles has taken that decision on Saturday. We will not actually see this bit. It consisted of holy oils, a particular kind of oil, an oil of chrism. I suppose I'm being a little bit irreverent, a kind of sacred Brühl cream that was in a receptacle called an ampulla. And we have a version of it here that will actually be used for the ceremony. But what we do have, which is quite extraordinary, we have a medieval spoon that we know was used from the 14th century onwards and probably long, long before. The oil is placed, well, basically all over the monarch. Why it's concealed isn't only that it's sacred. In the Middle Ages, the monarch would have been stripped to the waist, if not more. The oil goes on the head, it goes on the shoulder blades, it goes on the breasts, it goes inside the arms there and on the hands. The oil, of course, is sacred oil. King Charles's oil has been specially consecrated in Jerusalem. So you've not simply got a monarch who is by divine right. You've got a monarch who is physically endowed with divine grace. How do you deal with that in a complicated politics? Because no matter how sacred the person of the king, no matter the religiosity of the coronation ceremony, monarchy was primarily the embodiment of political power. As such, it could be subject to violent seizure and overthrow. The Anglo-Saxon kings would experience this less than a century after Edgar was crowned. Because in 1066, a dispute over the succession to the crown would change the course of our history, even the language which we speak, and you can see it all in the Bayeux tapestry. When the saintly King Edward the Confessor died without children, the crown fell to his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson. But across the English Channel was the ruthless and piratical William, Duke of Normandy, armed with a formidable host of knights, and what he claimed was a promise from the now-dead King Edward that he should inherit the crown of England. William invaded and crushed the forces of his rival at the Battle of Hastings. He was crowned here at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, where every subsequent monarch but one has celebrated their coronation, including our new king, Charles III. I'm getting myself ready to do a lecture this evening at the British-Hungarian Society on coronations. Now, I find when I'm about to give a lecture, it focuses the old mind. A big idea came into my head. Hungary is a republic, but it's got a crown on top of its coat of arms. So I thought, aha, let's do a lecture on the crowned republic of Hungary and of Britain. Because in Britain, the king swears an oath, and if he breaks it, do you know what? He loses his crown. Let's try it out. I'm a creature, that wonderful denigrating phrase, television historian. The sneer which the academic inflict upon you. I remember once when the even worse term was flung at me, popular historian, to which I responded, I suppose it's better than being an unpopular historian. Anyway, it might seem strange that the rule of William the Conqueror, who had seized and ruled England by brutal force, would eventually give way to a limited monarchy that depended on the consent of the people, however defined. But in order to rule effectively, William and his descendants knew that they had to keep their militarily powerful barons on side. When they forgot this fact, as King John did in the early 13th century, the nobles were quick to remind them. Constantly raising taxes in order to pay for his disastrous wars in France, John faced mounting noble resistance, until, in 1215, he was compelled to seal the document that became the foundation stone of the English Constitution, Magna Carta. Effectively a peace treaty between the warring sides, it put into writing 63 chapters defining the rights and responsibilities of the crown and its subjects. No sooner was the ink dry, however, than the king renounced it, triggering renewed civil war and a French invasion. Paradoxically, the situation was saved by John's death the following year. His son, Henry III, was crowned within 10 days here in Gloucester Cathedral. He was just 9, wearing a set of child-sized royal robes and crowned with one of his mother's bracelets. But there was politics behind the pageantry, as the boy's regents headed off opposition by reissuing Magna Carta in his name. But it was Magna Carta shorn of its contentious Chapter 61, which had put real power in the hands of a committee of 25 barons and reduced the king to a mere figurehead. Instead, a new forum for balancing crown and people was forged. It took its name from the French parler, to speak. This is the Palace of Westminster, which, from the late 13th century, becomes more and more the regular meeting place of that peculiar English thing called Parliament. Most European kingdoms have got estates in which the clergy, the first estate, the nobility, the second, and the common folk, or their representatives, meet separately. The English Parliament's different. Not 3 estates, but 2 houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. In the House of Lords, there are the great nobles, the Duke, Marquises, Earls, and so on, and the very rich and important bishops and abbots. Then in the House of Commons, there are the representatives of the counties and the towns. And already, by the 14th century, you'll get the judges saying, every law passed by Parliament binds everybody in the kingdom because everybody is represented there, either in person in the House of Lords or by their representative in the House of Commons. There's something else that's very peculiar about the English Parliament. The estates of most countries, frankly, are just a nuisance. They exist to get in the way of royal government and to obstruct it. In England, Parliament becomes part of royal government, an essential part. It's the only place you can make law, it's the only place you can legally raise taxation, and it's the creation, and here we get it so wrong, of strong kings, not weak ones, but it takes strong kings to manage it. The archetype of a strong king was Edward I, and the archetype of a weak one was his son, Edward II. His nobles were immediately suspicious of him, and at his coronation in 1308 he was compelled to swear a new oath with an extraordinary additional clause to uphold the rightful laws and customs which the people shall have chosen. But Edward's weakness and favouritism meant that he repeatedly broke the promises he'd made, and that would lead to his bloody end here. This is the guardroom of Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. It's here that King Edward II was brought after he'd been defeated and captured by his outraged wife, Queen Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, Earl of March. Meanwhile, in London, something unheard of was happening. A parliament was summoned to oversee the quasi-legal deposition of a king, a dirty deed to be done in public according to a sort of law. They drew up what were called the Articles of Accusation. The basic charge was that Edward had always listened to evil counsel and that he'd refused good counsel. This meant that he'd done unworthy, unseemly things, that he had lost to the Scots, lost at Bannockburn, lost the great lands of England in France. It meant also that he had damaged the church. He had murdered, stripped of their lands, great nobles. And then the clause that summarises everything, it turns back to the coronation oath. It accused the king of having sworn to do justice and having failed to do justice and having failed to honour all the other clauses of his coronation oath. And finally it said he was incorrigible. In other words, he'd broken a contract. The oath has shifted. It's not an oath now, primarily between God and the king. It's an oath, a conditional oath between the king and his people. Edward has broken it, and very rarely has breach of contract been punished more horribly. He's murdered, and the two stories of the murder. One is that he's pressed to death on his bed under a table. The other, the one that schoolboys always like, that a bull's horn was shoved up his fundament, followed by a red-hot poker. The people in Parliament had asserted an unprecedented power, using the coronation oath to impose terms upon the king and holding him to those terms by force. But just over half a century after Edward II was murdered, a new king came to the throne with a profoundly different sense of monarchy. Because Richard II treated the idea of consecration at his coronation with profound reverence. His was rule by divine right, and he wasn't going to be answerable to a rabble of petty nobles. This is the Wilton diptych, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, medieval painting in the world. And it shows King Richard II here kneeling in adoration before the Virgin, the figure there with the halo, carrying the baby, the golden baby with his halo, the Christ child. Diptych means a painting of two halves, two leaves. But again, there's another sense in which this is a painting of two halves. Here we have the ethereal vision of divine right monarchy, but behind it, there's something darker, much more dangerous, gangsterish, nasty. Let's look at the ethereal first. Richard is born on the 6th of January. That's the feast of the Epiphany, when the three wise men, having seen the star that manifests the fact that the baby Jesus is actually divine, is the Son of God, travel to worship in the stable in Bethlehem. And we've got here three kings. We've got Richard himself. We've got behind St. Edward, Edward the Confessor, who was the founder saint of the monarchy. And remember, it's in front of his tomb that Richard was crowned. And if you look carefully, you'll see Edward is holding a ring. Richard would actually have had that coronation ring of Edward put on his finger, because from the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, they actually used Edward the Confessor's funeral regalia to crown the new king, the literal touching with the saint. And then here is another great English royal saint, St. Edmund, king of the Angles of the East Saxons, who was defeated in battle by the Vikings and shot to death with arrows before he had his head cut off, because the Vikings believed in doing things thoroughly. So you've got three kings, a living king of England and two of his predecessors, both sainted. But it's also the 6th of January, again, this layering of religious belief. The 6th of January then was also the feast of the baptism of Christ by St. John the Baptist, who is here with his lamb, which is also the Lamb of God, presenting Richard to the Virgin and the Christ child. That's the world of ethereal monarchy, of the king blessed by the multitude of saints at one with the kingdom of heaven. But look a little bit more carefully. Richard has got a collar round his neck, gold, and hanging from it is the badge of the White Hart. Okay, right, all nice and symbolic. Monarchs wear badges and chains, don't they? Look over here, though, and there's something really rather odd. We've got a signal that suddenly heaven has been taken over by England, and probably by Richard, because we can actually see one of the angels is holding the banner of St. George. And if you look very, very carefully at the top, you'll see there's the orb, the thing that Richard had as his coronation, that appears on his coronation portrait. You can see it up there. And again, this minute quality of the picture, there is England reflected in the orb. But there's another way in which this isn't just England, it's Richard. Because each one of the angels, do you know what, is wearing a broomscod collar and the badge of the White Hart. Now, this is where suddenly the whole thing shifts from the ethereal to the brutal and the political. Because what Richard does is to underpin his claim to divine right by ruling effectively as a gangster. Historians call these things, the collars and the badges, they call them the symbols of bastard feudalism. What had happened in the 100 Years' War against France, of course, was that the great nobility had built up military followings, and to identify them in battle, they give them these symbols, they give them these badges. But of course, Richard's accession marks the collapse of England's efforts in France. Richard tries to maintain peace with France, and the nobles and their followers come home. And England finds itself as a kind of gangster monarchy. The king had got two choices. Could he suppress bastard feudalism? Well, Richard makes a shot at it. I think it's just nominal. What he really chooses to do is to make himself the biggest bastard feudal lord of them all, richer, more powerful, and with more retainers, his Cheshire archers, who also wear that and intimidate even Parliament itself.
England's nobles weren't going to stand for this intimidation, but even in the face of rebellion, Richard refused to depart from his belief in his divine right to rule, as Shakespeare captures in his portrait of the king.
Not all the water in the rough, rude sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. For every man Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown, God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Then, if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the right.
But it was no good. Led by his own cousin, the nobles were too strong, and Richard was deposed, once again in a sort of parliamentary trial. He was accused of behaving as though the laws were in his mouth, as if he alone had the power to make law, and not the king in Parliament. In short, that he'd broken his coronation oath. Imprisoned, he was probably starved to death.
His attempt to remodel England's kingship had ended in agonizing failure. The deposition and murder of Richard II left the noble-dominated Parliament more powerful than ever, so powerful in fact that it became impossible to control. Eventually, unshackled by monarchical authority, civil war broke out. The Wars of the Roses pitted two factions of the royal family against each other, and the struggle of the House of Lancaster and the House of York tore the kingdom apart. Only in 1485 was one man capable of returning the country to stability. Henry VII, a Lancastrian by remote descent, claimed the throne and promptly married Elizabeth of York, merging the two houses into a single dynasty, the Tudors. But the strictly policed parameters of the English monarchy didn't sit well with this ambitious and ruthless family. And shortly into his reign, Henry VII commissioned the making of a new crown. Bigger, heavier, and more splendid than any before, it symbolized the resurgence of the monarchy. The band of the crown alternated the crosses of England with the fleur-de-lis of France, and it was surmounted by two intersecting arches, which signified imperial power. The new crown imperial hinted at the grandness of Henry VII's ambitions. His son, England's most imperious king, would stretch the notion of limited monarchy to its breaking point.
We all know that Henry VIII had 6 wives, but we're less familiar with the fact that Henry planned a second coronation, probably here in York Minster, where he came in the summer of 1541 with his 5th wife, Catherine Howard. He even seems to have carried out a revision of his original coronation oath, which he knew, by the way, that he'd broken for the event. And actually, there's a very close connection between the number of wives and the plan for a second coronation. Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon had begun as a love marriage, but things had cooled when Catherine only gave him a daughter. Remember, no woman has sat on the throne of England yet. And also, poor woman, she lost her figure and age quickly because of the repeated failed pregnancies. But what changed everything was the arrival at court of Anne Boleyn. Anne had been brought up in France, where she'd mastered the language, more importantly, become a mistress of the arts of courtly love. The result was that she had men at her feet, including principally Henry. The two of them pledged to marry on the 1st of January, 1527. They couldn't have chosen a worse time to do it, because at exactly that moment, Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, was making himself master of Italy, where his troops, in a month or two, would conquer, would sack Rome, and actually capture the Pope. But if the Pope couldn't or wouldn't give Henry his divorce, he'd have to get it in England. This meant rewriting all the rules of church and state. Some imaginative historical research discovered that Henry had an imperial power that meant that he, and not the Pope, was head of the church. Henry, by careful management and after 6 years, persuaded Parliament to agree. Henry and Anne were married in January 1536, and she was given a magnificent coronation in May. But I'm afraid Anne was as unpopular as Camilla in the 1990s, and the London mob at the coronation procession, where there were, of course, ciphers, H.A., Henry and Anne, sent them up as only the London mob can, by raucous laughter. Ha, 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 ha. The marriage lasted for barely 3 years before Anne, in turn, was divorced and beheaded. But though he got rid of Anne, Henry clung on to those principles which had enabled him to marry her. The royal supremacy over the church, the idea of the imperial crown of England,
and the shrewd management of Parliament. And we'll find all of them here in his revision of the Coronation Oath. Holy Church becomes the Church of England, the church of which Henry was, of course, the head. And all the traditional promises to keep the peace between church and people, to respect the ancient laws of the kingdom, they're all made subject to Henry's rights as king and to the powers of the imperial crown of the realm. But what's also striking is that Henry shows his knowledge and understanding of Parliament. So instead of the vague promise that the king would rule according to the laws chosen by the people, Henry carefully writes it all out. He will rule according to the laws chosen by the nobles and people, but, as indeed was the case, subject to the royal consent in an act of Parliament. Henry understood Parliament. He even incorporates it in effect in his new, never used Coronation Oath.
Henry VIII died the most powerful king England had ever had, at the apex not just of temporal but spiritual power. The crowning of his son would dramatize this new imperial monarchy and its partnership with Parliament.
The coronation of Henry's son, the boy King Edward, has traditionally been seen as a resounding statement of Tudor absolutism. Do you know what? I think this is plain wrong. Now, granted, the imperial crown, that great arch symbol of Henry's power, is placed on the boy's head after he's already been crowned with the St. Edward crown. But when you come to the revised Coronation Oath, it tells a very different story. On the one hand, as you'd expect, we're now in a Protestantizing England. Traditional references to St. Edward and his laws, they're all struck out. But when you come to the king's crucial promise to rule according to the law, just listen to it. Do you grant to make no new laws, but such as shall be to the honour and glory of God and to the good of the commonwealth, and that the same shall be made by the consent of your people as hath been accustomed? There it is, consent in Parliament, explicitly spelled out.
But this vision of a strong Protestant Renaissance kingship came to naught. Aged just 15, Edward VI was struck down, probably by tuberculosis. His eventual successor, Mary I, sought to bring England back to Catholicism and burned some 300 Protestant heretics, including the former Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. But when Mary died childless, Henry VIII's will, endorsed by Act of Parliament, handed the throne to her half-sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the offspring of Henry VIII's second marriage, which had launched the Reformation, and her mother was Anne Boleyn, whose coronation procession had provoked mockery from much of the London crowd. Elizabeth was determined instead that her own coronation procession would unify, and she spent a fortune on it.
This is the Tower of London, because the old coronation procession was much bigger and longer than the present one. It left from the Tower, and then it went right through the city, along Fleet Street and the Strand to Westminster. So it was from here, the Tower, that on the 14th of January 1559, Queen Elizabeth set forth on her coronation procession. She was wearing cloth of gold, and she was reclining on a cushioned throne, also covered in white cloth of gold, in a great white cloth of gold litter with a canopy over it, borne on two great horses. She was sitting in her hair like a bride, that extraordinary golden hair, with a gold circlet on her head, and riding just behind was the man who was closest to her, her master of the horse, Lord Robert Dudley. Along the processional route, there were pageants. Here, in Gracechurch Street, it consisted of 3 stages. On the lower stage were Elizabeth's grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. On the middle stage, her actual parents, Henry VIII and, yes, Anne Boleyn. And then on the 3rd stage, at the top, Elizabeth herself. That was her dynastic claim to the throne.
Here in Cornhill, the pageant showed the virtues and the vices, but they've been rejigged a bit. The principal virtue is true religion, that's Protestantism, and the chief vice is superstition, that's popery or Catholicism. The last pageant was here in Fleet Street at the edge of the city, and it showed Elizabeth as Deborah, the female judge and general of the ancient Israelites. But throughout the procession, something odd had happened. The Queen had answered back, and there was a reporter with a little notebook alongside her, jotting down everything that she said, and it was published in a pamphlet. And the preface to the pamphlet said that the city had become a stage in which the people had seen and heard their Queen.
Elizabeth's coronation itself was a compromise between inherited Catholic ritual and the Queen's undogmatically Protestant convictions, because, Protestant though she was, she had a very un-Protestant love of ceremony and music. This would be one bone of contention between Queen and Parliament: the succession. Her marriage, foreign policy and finance were others, but the tensions never got out of hand, since she was a mistress of the art of compromise, and of the kind of language which only a woman could use so well. "Though God hath raised me high," she told her last Parliament in 1601, "yet this I account the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves." In the retrospect of what would follow, it would seem like a golden age. Elizabeth's death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. The Virgin Queen had spurned the advances of countless suitors throughout her reign, believing any husband would seek to control her and her kingdom. So it was that her crown fell to her cousin of the House of Stuart, James VI of Scotland. Not since the days of the Anglo-Saxons had the two usually implacably hostile kingdoms been united under one crown. Even the great war leader Edward I had failed to bring Scotland under his control, though he had appropriated the ancient coronation seat of the Scots, the Stone of Scone. James VI, now also James I of England, was determined to make a success of what he called the Blessed Union, of which he became the physical embodiment. His position as a unifier of crowns imbued him with a unique authority, and having acceded to the English throne in unspoken defiance of Henry VIII's will, itself endorsed by Parliament, James believed that the crown was his by indefeasible hereditary right. For the first time since the days of Edward II and Richard II, here was a king who didn't fully accept the constraints placed on a monarch by English custom, who'd a notion of kingship elevated above the limitations of English law and resting primarily on divine right. James was a clever man, sensitive to his status as an outsider in England, and although he believed intellectually in the divine right of kings, he understood the necessity of keeping England's Parliament on side. But for his son Charles I, the divine right wasn't simply an academic position. He believed in it with all his heart and soul. Charles I was the most ceremonious of kings. His coronation was one of the best organised and the best recorded on record. The man in charge of arrangements was the future Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. He believed deeply in the beauty of holiness, and the coronation was an opportunity, as it were, to advertise his wares. Indeed, one of his enemies described him as an ecclesiastical master of ceremonies. So, there were actually rehearsals for the first time. Even better, from our point of view, Laud, in the text of the coronation service, keeps notes as to what the king actually did. This enables us to get right into the mind of Charles I, how he used that ancient coronation regalia. Normally, the items were just touched against the king. Not with Charles. He insists on actually placing his feet with shoes inside the ancient buskins or sandals, and Laud notes there was a risk of tearing the taffeta, the ancient cloth of gold, the Anglo-Saxon comb, which, as far as we know, had never actually been used for combing the king's hair after the oil of unction had been put upon it. Well, Charles, immaculate about his appearance, carefully uses it. Now, what's this? Is it curiosity? I think it's something more. Charles is using those ancient items of the regalia as kind of sacraments of monarchy. The touch made him holy. For the first time, the king was making his respect for the laws of the land in some way conditional on his own separate royal prerogative. In other words, he put an authority inherent in his person above his powers exercised in Parliament. Charles was an uncomfortable fit for the limited English monarchy in a largely Protestant country. His contempt for Parliament came to a head dramatically in January 1642, when he marched into the House of Commons to demand the arrest of his political opponents. When the Speaker of the House was commanded to give them up, his response came to embody the idea of the House of Commons as a chamber inviolable by monarchical authority. I have neither eyes to see, nor tongues to speak in this place, but as this House directs me, the Speaker said. The battle lines of England's civil war had been drawn. On one side, Charles and his royalists asserted his supremacy over both church and state. On the other, parliamentarians believed that the king had exceeded his authority. His powers must be limited and subject to law. In making their case, the parliamentarians referred to the ancient customs of England. But as the bitter wars persisted throughout the 1640s, there emerged a new, harder brand of parliamentary soldier, led by possibly England's greatest general, Oliver Cromwell. To Cromwell and his radical soldiers, Charles was a tyrant and a traitor who must be held to account for his crimes. Cromwell's new model army crushed royalist forces by the end of the decade, captured the king and brought him to trial before a court appointed on the sole authority of the House of Commons, itself purged by the army and acting in the name of the people of England, who are, under God, the original of all just power. The charge was that Charles, being entrusted with a limited power, had broken his coronation oath to govern by and according to the law of the land. Edward II and Richard II had faced the same accusation, but they were murdered in secret. Charles was publicly executed after a public trial, and more than an individual king was intended to die on the scaffold.
On the 30th of January 1649, King Charles I was brought to the banqueting house behind me here. It was the throne room of his old palace. He stepped through the middle window onto a high black draped scaffold on which there was a block on which he would be beheaded. He addressed the bishop who was guiding him spiritually and said, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where there is no disturbance at all." And he took the garter jewel that he wore around his neck and handed it over to be given to his eldest son with the words, "Remember." And then he prostrated himself, his head on the block, and as he extended his hand, his head was taken off at a single stroke. The king was dead, but there was now an attempt at actually destroying not just the king, but kingship. The crown jewels were smashed every single one of them. The royal possessions were sold, and there was an attempt at destroying the very idea of king, the very word. The office was declared unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous, and was to be extirpated. The king was dead. Kingship, too, was dead. The end of the reign of King Charles I.